very much. It's a pleasure. Start thinking about what you want to ask, and at the point, absolutely unscripted. We have nothing prepared. I'm sure everybody's happy that you didn't have to prepare for this. There's absolutely no limits to what you can ask. Whatever you're intrigued about, whatever you want to know about. Notice I'm not promising we'll answer the questions. We're just saying you can ask the questions. So start thinking about things you want to ask, just about anything, about life, about programming, about software, about frameworks, about technology, anything you want to talk about. I'm going to let the panel take a few minutes to introduce themselves very briefly. That way it gives you a little bit time to think about what you want to talk about also. Why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself, anything you want us here to know about, please.
So hi everybody, I'm delighted to be here. So I work as an Android app developer. And I'm a huge Kotlin enthusiast. Over the last 1.5 years that I've been working with Android, I've come to love it, and I've come to love Kotlin. And that's what I do during the day. So as a weekend project or by the night, I work on machine learning and TensorFlow often, and I love reading about blockchain because I think it has huge promises. So as a hobby, I think I love playing table tennis and I love poetry.
Awesome. Very cool. Michael, what's your name?
Michael. Yes, Michael. I'm Michael. So I have a bit of an unusual biography. You've seen me in the program. I actually quit my day job as a software engineer several years ago to work as a full-time magician. And the cruel irony of life, of course, is I spend more time writing code now than I ever did as a corporate coder. Yes, I don't know if that earns applause or not, but I'll take it. I'll always take applause. That's why I became a magician, because I like the applause. So thank you. Wait, who just one person? No, I take it back. I don't universally like applause. Because I think there's nothing more disconcerting than the sound of one person clapping, especially when it's one person slow clapping. So my role is altogether not at all, but I will say one thing just to tack on to what Dr. Subramaniam said, is ask about everything. I mean, definitely your skills, your core skills, the technologies that we work with and the technologies that are coming in the future are definitely important topics to ask about, but a lot of, certainly what's made me successful is all the other things that I've spent some of my life energy on. Being a magician made me a better software engineer. Pursuing all these ancillary things made me a better software engineer. So ask about life, ask about some of these other things, because they all benefit us in unexpected ways in our life and in our careers.
All right, Scott.
My name is Scott Davis. I'm a principal engineer and architect with ThoughtWorks. All of my talks today are focusing on vanilla HTML, vanilla JavaScript, web components immediately after this talk, and accessibility in SD Hall 1. I hope you'll get a chance to join me for that accessibility talk. I really feel that's one of the most important talks I have in my portfolio.
Cool.
Yeah, so my name is Pavan Podila, and I've been doing UI as long as I can remember, actually. So when I was growing up, I wanted to become a graphic designer, a painter, actually. And I told my parents that I want to paint the billboards if I can get a job like that. Obviously, nobody agreed to making that a career out of it. So eventually, I decided to get into computer science to some accident, playing games eventually. But I thought playing games would actually allow my dad to buy a computer, because you know what, after all, how do you play games if you don't have a computer? So taking a degree in computer science would allow me to actually get a computer so I can play games, and then the rest will be rolling out for itself. But of course, life didn't work out that way. I ended up doing a lot of UI and programming and building my own games and discovering the joy of UI development in general. And so these days, I spend most of my time writing React, Angular, but I also delved in the past with .NET, WPF, other kinds of frameworks like iOS, macOS. I just love exploring the UI in general, and that's what I do for a living as well. I'm actually the lead at the interactive practice at Sapien, by the way.
My name is Ken Cousin. I primarily work on Java-related topics, streams, lambdas, method references, but also in the Groovy area, Grails, Gradle, a little bit with Kotlin, and especially with Android, as you say, as well. Good to see you.
Yeah.
So I'm only a one-person company, though, so it's Cousin IT, or as my wife says, Cousin Ed. It's her idea. So.
Okay, hi. My name is Kito, Mann, and let's see. I come from a Java background. Java came out when I was in college, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, which is kind of funny now, but I remember printing out the Java language specification in the computer lab, getting all excited. So I kind of built my career after that on top of Java, but over the years it went into sort of enterprise Java and then also web applications and technologies like Java server faces and things like that. And I've been working with a lot of that stuff for a long time. And what I found over the years, though, is that I ended up being on teams where there are a lot of Java developers who didn't know anything about the front end, and I would be working with Java server faces components and JavaScript and more of the nuances of the components and how they interacted with the browser. So fast forward to today, I still work with Java, enterprise Java stuff, whole Java EE or Jakarta EE as they call it now. But I also spend a lot of time working with pure front-end development with technologies like web components and Polymer being probably the most passionate thing I'm into. But I also work with Angular, and I still work with components that I used to work with before, except now they're Angular versions. So I used to work with Prime Faces. Now I work with Prime NG as well, which is the Angular component suite. So my talks this week are mostly about those things. And there's a good talk on Thursday if you're into, or if you're interested about front-end stuff and you're a Java developer. It's kind of a good talk about that kind of stuff. One other thing I want to mention is that I'm also a getting things done fanatic. Getting things done is a productivity methodology that I'll be talking about on Friday. And one of the things I found is that very successful people have a process for being efficient. And I'm really into productivity, so that's another area as well. And I have a suggestion for a question, which is, what's up with Scott's shoes?
Very good. My name is Venkat Subramaniam. I've had the absolute pleasure of being in this conference for several years now. I program, I teach, I consult, I mentor. I program, generally programming languages are my favorite. Try not to be affiliated with one particular language. I program in multiple languages. Just enjoy programming, that's all. So, ready for your questions and thoughts. Who has the first question? Please come over to the mic, say your name to us, anything else you want to say about yourselves, and then fire away. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rajesh Advani, and I work with Sapient. Basically, the recent events have shown us that there is an ethical impact of the technologies we create, right? And it's something that was not considered to be the part of the domain of computer science before. Civil engineering maybe, physics, chemistry definitely, biology definitely, but not computer science. Obviously, that's changing. So, I just wanted your perspectives on what that means for us today.
So the question is, there is a very high impact on ethics in computer programming these days than it used to be. Fields like medicine, of course, always had it. So what are your thoughts on ethics?
So just to clarify, basically, like the solutions we create, they can be used, misused beyond our wildest dreams, right? To have an impact on the world.
So I'll start by saying, not quite answering your question, but this is something to think about. If you ask me what's probably the most exciting course I ever took in my education, this was when I was in my PhD program. We had to take a course on computer ethics. And in that particular course, this was nearly 30 years ago now, but we had to take happenings in the industry and then argue about, something may be legal versus illegal, but something that's legal may actually be unethical. So we actually had a curriculum to really talk about it. Unfortunately, a lot of universities over the few decades have kind of pushed it away and instead started focusing way too much on technology. In a way, I would even argue in terms of what I call as commodity courses, which I really hate, where they try to teach you many frameworks rather than teaching the depth of critical thinking. So there are curriculums still where students are required to go through the courses on ethics as well, but that's kind of throwing that in.
You know, the Facebook scandal just happened recently within weeks, and I'm sure we'll get an opportunity to talk about that. But also a year or two ago, there was the Volkswagen scandal,
Right.
where in the United States, all cars have to go through emissions checks. And there were software engineers that worked for Volkswagen that had written code specifically to detect when the when the automobile is in an emissions test, and it would do the right thing while it was in the emissions testing. And then it was discovered that when it was not in emissions testing, the emissions were 20 to 40 to 100 times worse than it was reported. And when that happened, it broke my heart because Volkswagen had done such a good job, a marketing campaign of trying to be a different kind of company, a very friendly and welcoming and environmentally aware company. They put flower vases built into every dashboard so you can have a fresh cut flower. And I have a friend who has a Volkswagen, and he does put a fresh cut flower in his car. That's what made that car so different. And when I read that this emissions scandal happened, and it wasn't a bug, this was code written with intent, it bothered me. And it made me consider what I would do in that situation. What would you do in that situation? I might open it up to the panel. What would you do if a manager came up and asked you to explicitly do something unethical to that degree? I would like to think that I would leave. That would be the line in the sand for me. But I know other people may not have that same freedom and that same ability. If you have a family and a house and things like that, it puts you in a very difficult position. But that was really challenging, and I went through a lot of the emotions I was feeling with Facebook all over again, but I did it a couple of years ago, and so it didn't hurt quite as much this time, but I was disappointed that there was another time that I had to consider those ethics in my industry.
Sure. And I think the interesting thing about that Volkswagen thing, and asking this question, what would you do? The reality is, I think as an industry in general, I don't think we would do as much as we would like to think, because we already have an overwhelming trend in our industry to allow ourselves to get railroaded by aggressive product owners, by other aggressive people in the business. That this is the reason why we work late and we work weekends and we keep giving more and more of our own time because we're not pushing back on all these things. And because we're not pushing back on the little things, I think it's going to be nearly impossible to push back on the big things, and that's one of the big challenges. You mentioned Facebook briefly, though, and I think that's interesting. I actually sat and watched all of the testimony over the 2 days or whatever it was. I just tuned it on and listened to it when I was working, and it was fascinating. And I think one of the big takeaways that I took away from that is that Facebook overall did a pretty good job of doing what they were supposed to do. They did a lot of things right, but I think that's because they know they're a little more under the microscope than Volkswagen. You wouldn't think, like you said, you wouldn't think that this is something that a company like that would do. But I would encourage everybody not in this room, but in our industry, to push back on the little things, the little lines that we allow to cross. So when we get to the big lines, we're a little more able, a little more practiced, a little more empowered to say no. But I will add one other thing. I think there's going to be a point where the engineers start getting held accountable, and I don't know when that tipping point is going to happen, but it's coming.
I think going back to what Scott said, I think this is where a relationship between an employee and the manager and the management makes a really big difference. I was fortunate enough to work for people who said, don't take what I say as a command. Instead, question me. You need to really tell me that I'm wrong when I'm wrong, because I don't want you to help me fail. And that really changed the way I would interact with my managers. I had the absolute, power to tell them, sorry, you're wrong. Not in a rude way, but in a very clear way to say, I don't think this is right to do. And they were more than eager to sit and talk rather than trying to slide things through. So I think that kind of relationship, that's again a question of where we work. That kind of work is very important to be selective in where we work as well.
And a lot of that also, by the way, comes down to having allies. I mean, you need to have other people who can stand with you under circumstances like that, because if you're by yourself, there's only so much you can do short of leaving.
Sure.
You do need, now, if you can have allies among management, so much the better. When an issue like that comes up, everybody's going to get hurt. I mean, it's going to be bad all around. But you need people to work with. And then, therefore, if you broaden the ethics discussion to morality in general, I think it's important to work to increase diversity, to make sure that people feel that they have a work environment where they can say what they think and work together with others in a productive way, and people aren't necessarily driven out of the industry, as has happened in many cases around there too. So I would include all that as well.
And I think this is something you can ask even during the hiring process of your entering into a company. Right? I mean, you can ask a question straight to your hiring manager, what are the kind of things that you will be possibly doing which could affect your ethics? Right? I mean, if you don't ask that question and if you're then forced to do something, you're probably at the losing end because you're already committed into being at a company and you already have something like a family and maybe a lot of financial commitments. It might be hard to leave even though you don't want to actually do that unethical task. Right? So it's something you can ask upfront when you join a company, like what are the certain practices and processes you follow for certain kinds of things, like security-oriented data or something of that sort. And maybe cut off those discussions and your choice to join a company right up front.
Yeah, you're interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. You're interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. I think that's a really important point.
Exactly.
To answer your question as well, Scott, I think it's definitely, I feel it's a developer's responsibility to hold ethics. Of course, the pressure might come from the stakeholders or the product managers or anywhere, and of course, the work culture, like you said, matters. But in the end, it's important that the developer make sure that he stands his ground. It's important to say that I will not do something unethical. Today, this question has become so important that even, I think, in the Stack Overflow developer survey that happened a couple of months back, this was one of the questions. The question was, whom do you think is accountable for the ethics of a software that is produced, whether it's the developer or the product manager or whom? And I voted for developer because it's difficult for us, it can be difficult for us in different situations for family or whatever it is. But it's important that if I say no, maybe others will say no too. You have to create that environment where you don't let something wrong happen, and that's important. So I feel it is a developer's responsibility, and we have to make sure that we don't write something that's unethical. We don't create a backdoor or anything. It's important.
Yeah, I think that's a very noble thought. It's just important not to push it on somebody and say, it's always easy, right? I would have done it if they were really wanting me to do. So absolutely applaud that. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Who has the next question? Please come on over.
Hi team, this is Kunal. I work with Oracle India developer team. I have a question. I'll probably take a few minutes. I just wanted to talk about what happened earlier. During with HTML, we had something called table hell. Now, when we are talking about div, we are somehow getting into the era of div hell. We're probably writing too much of code for all of that. And now, if I just think about a moment, think again, and then I see that there's a lot of programming language coming, a lot of framework coming. Just for a small thing also, even for JavaScript, if you look at JavaScript web, it's like plethora of framework languages are coming there. Earlier it was a Dojo, then EXT.js, today it is React, tomorrow it will be something else. How are we getting into a technology hell here?
Can I add NPM to that?
Go ahead.
So div is an interesting edge case that ends up being, unfortunately, the primary case for most developers. If you read the HTML spec, I'm sorry for suggesting that. I know no one reads the HTML spec. If you consider yourself a web developer and you read the HTML spec, or go to MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, their online documentation is really outstanding and admittedly a lot more accessible than the spec itself. So if you went to MDN and looked up any other element it would discuss the semantics of that element. This paragraph is not about appearance. A paragraph semantically is a paragraph. A link is a link. An image is an image. If you read the description of div, it says this is a semantically null element. This element means nothing. If you read it on span, div, of course, is a block element. Span is in line. If you go on and read the MDN description of span, they go so far as to say, this should be the element of last resort. This should be the element you choose if no other elements capture the semantics that you're trying to present. Yet so many of the developers I deal with lead with divs and spans to the point where they say, why do we even bother with all these other elements? I could do everything I need with a div and a span. And so I encourage you to go and read the HTML spec, please, if you're a web developer. Read the first paragraph, because they say HTML is the language of the web, and HTML is about semantics. It's about describing the document. And if we as developers spent more time focusing on semantics and less time focusing on syntax, I think our entire industry would be better off.
Only one problem with that. I don't think that was anywhere near the question he asked.
Remember the rules. We get to answer whatever we want.
So if you really think about it, look at almost every other human activity. Look at medicine, look at construction. And given all these different fields, they have been around for literally hundreds and thousands of years. Medicine, especially if you really think about it, medicine was very primitive as late as 1800s. Only after 1850, things really got to be mature. Then you look at our field, we are in the infancy. If you consider the amount of time we have spent on various other activities to how much time we've been doing software. We've been doing software for about 50, 60 years. There are people probably in this room who are older than software, actually. And that's kind of scary when you think about it. So the key is to really make more mistakes. The key is to really do more exploration and innovation and learn from those mistakes. If we wanted stability, we are born in the wrong time to be in this field. This is the time of uncertainty. This is a time of explosion. This is a time of disruption. And that's exactly what we want right now. Any desire to stabilize is naive, in my opinion. So, I mean, I feel your pain. I'm not suggesting I don't, but I'm willing to take the pain as a professional in this field, because if I wanted stability, I should be doing accounting. Not tax accounting, though. That's a very different situation, but accounting. So that's the key. So I think we are in it for it because there's a reason why things are like that. It's way too early in the game for any stability and maturity.
Venkat, you mentioned the analogy of doctors 200 years ago. So you're saying that right now the analogy is the way a doctor 200 years ago would throw leeches at the problem, we're throwing divs at the problem.
That's it.
Oh, very nice.
Absolutely.
I think that
Go for it, Kito.
when it comes to the front-end area, though, I think I agree with you that there's always going to be flux, and that's what's brilliant about the internet and software development in general, and it needs to be that way. But that doesn't mean that you need to learn every new framework right when it comes out. And it also means that frameworks will, and libraries, whatever, will attack different areas depending on what void there is in the platform. So, for example, back in the early days of web development with Java, there were tons of different Java web frameworks. There was like a new one every week, just like the JavaScript frameworks. Then there was a standard one called JSF, and then the number over the years dwindled down to a handful. Now, so it didn't go away, but they dwindled. And some people put their energy into building stuff on top of the standard. And the same thing is happening with web technologies. The web platform is a tremendous surface, and I don't think many people realize how powerful browsers are today. And more standards are getting baked in. And at this point in the browser world, there's pretty good synergy between the different browser vendors for the first time in many years. So a lot of these things are actually getting implemented in browsers, especially in Safari and Chrome. And a lot of the things that people were trying to do years ago with frameworks, like, for example, jQuery. How many people lead today saying, I'm going to write an application in jQuery? Anybody? But a few years ago, hey, you'd be like, hey, I'm going to write an application in jQuery, right? Now, just because of a few things that have been added to the DOM APIs, you can call document.querySelector. There's half a jQuery right there. So I think as time goes on, different frameworks will attack different problems. I think Web Components is a good example. There's all these different component models, and Web Components is built into the browsers too. So over time, we're going to see that change. And even frameworks like Angular use a lot of that stuff under the hood. So when it comes to picking a technology, it's important to sort of see where the platform is that the technology is built, or the framework is built on top of, what problems it's trying to solve. And if it's solving something that the platform already solves, probably not a good choice.
Well, you're also talking about the fact that you get all these frameworks and all these languages that are all trying to find different abstractions as a way to solve a problem, certainly. But our problem, of course, with this explosion in the number of frameworks and languages is one of the fundamental features of IT is that, I always say there's two aspects to it, that there's never enough time to learn everything you need, and the stuff you've already learned changes. And therefore, our entire careers boil down to prioritizing, figuring out what's worth my time, and as I get older, I go, what's worth my energy, too, because sometimes I'll come home and sit on the couch, and that's it, I'm done. And one of the nice things about coming to a conference like this is that you can see what people in the community have decided is worth their time and worth their energy, what people who are actively in the marketplace are doing and what they're deciding is worthwhile. And Twitter helps with things like that, other social media. There could be all kinds of downsides to those things, but the fact is we're always overwhelmed with too much information and trying to decide what we are going to spend our time on. And coming to a conference like this is one way that you can use to help make the decision as to whether it's a particular aspect is worth it or not.
Well, explosion of the experimentation is also actually equally key to having all these kinds of solutions to the same problem. That you had Angular, your React, Vue, Ember, Backbone, and so on. They're all trying to solve this problem from a different mentality, different perspective. And in doing so, they have reached some kind of a consensus. Like component-oriented development is a good idea. Breaking styles into its own components is a good idea. Not having to deal with HTML directly, but instead talking in terms of high-level abstractions like components is a good idea. And those are the kinds of things which will get pushed down into the platform at some point, like web components. But at some point, you realize the semantics is actually more important and not the mechanics of achieving that particular meaning. Right? So instead of putting a collection of divs together, you just put one tag, which is the component, and that takes care of all the mechanics of how this should be achieved. Right? And this will happen eventually through web components, where you try to push things down into the platform, so you don't really worry about it. It's like the electricity and water, right? You just open the tap and you expect the water to come out, and that's what you can expect from the platform as well at some point. Things will just happen the way you expect it to happen, without having to kind of wire things together and feel like a system admin all the time.
That's really, I like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, just medicine era, and the era that we are living in is basically a disruption era, which is so right in all terms. What we are doing today is we have gone through, if you're talking about analogy from table hell to div hell to different technologies today, it's just an evolution. Why are we calling these kind of evolution as a mistake? We shouldn't be calling table hell as a mistake. Table hell probably was done that one time, was right. But maybe at some point in time we realized that this was a problem, and to fix that, we came up with more semantics, which is what is rightly put in HTML spec. Today, if you are talking about, at least I can talk about myself, I probably put more insistence on what we are doing in terms of semantics. And we probably try to code application in terms of semantics only. But why we are calling those things as our hell, or basically signifying those as mistakes.
Sometimes hell has to be called as hell. Next person, please.
Yeah.
Please, come on over.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sridhar. I have a question to everyone as well. If we go back 20 years, so we used to have physical objects. Say, for example, if I have to wake up, so I used to set up an alarm clock, which was physical one. And if I have to say, if I have to come back, if I have to drive from my home to here, I used to ask a person nearby and ask me to get the directions here. And say, for example, if I have to get up and switch on or switch off the fan, I have to do physically. So right now, I see all these physical objects are disappearing. So the first example, I don't see any physical clocks now. I guess everyone uses their software. So right now I see only this one.
Alarm clock.
The last one standing.
Yeah.
This is a museum.
Modern art.
Yes, so for the second instance, I see everyone uses Google Maps. So nobody stops nearby and asks any physical person, okay, can you give me a direction to go to GITS or Jane Tata Auditorium? And the lastly, of course, now home automation is driving people everywhere in their homes. So now if I have to put a question on all these things, so what is happening is the Facebook scam, and also like if you go to myactivity.google.com, so everything is revolving around the personal data. So Google tracks me wherever I go. So wherever I stay for some time.
Even where I didn't go, it tracks.
Yes. Yes. So like, are we heading in the right direction, or are we losing most of the things that were present earlier? I mean, with respect to the personal data, how secure we are.
Well, I'm going to let the panel talk about it, but Sridhar, when you're saying this, there's one thing that kept coming in my mind. You're talking about we used to interact with these objects, but I want to just point out one object. To turn on the TV, we use remotes. Anyone knows what happened before there were remotes?
So we used to get.
They asked
You had
children to do exactly.
Children.
I was the child. So I'm happy for where we are going.
That's why you moved out. They didn't need you anymore.
Absolutely.
We got a thing for this now. There's an app for that.
It's a good thing you're not bitter about it.
I think that I think the whole personal data issue is something that we collectively as the human race is going to decide, because there are different companies with different models, right? Google and Facebook, their business is largely based around tracking you and your personal data. Apple claims that's not the case. There may be other companies in different, countries or that come along down the road that will have different models, right? So I think, especially the Facebook scandal really emphasizes that it's up to us to decide what these companies take or what the exchange is in terms of their services for our personal information. And it's up to us to make sure that we're at least that we can be made aware of actually what they know.
Unfortunately, it's not real practical, though. I mean, well, it isn't. I mean, one of the questions that wasn't asked to Zuckerberg, for example, is what about the information that's being collected that people are not aware of? What about the things that they do not have a setting to turn on and off?
Very specifically, if you're using Facebook on an Android phone,
Right.
it kept track of every voice call you made, every text message.
Messenger, not Facebook, but yes.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
but the point is, you didn't opt in,
Right.
and it was tracking metadata. And when you downloaded it, they said, "Oh, I now have a record of
Right.
every time I called my grandmother."
But the point is, you know this now.
Now, but not
because
necessarily.
we started caring.
Yeah.
That's my point, is that unless we as people actually push on these companies, it's not going to change.
Well, yeah, but the problem is the stuff we don't know. You know what I mean? It's how can we be responsible for our information if it's being collected in ways we're not aware of? Who reads through one of these long terms
Right.
of conditions documents and all that? So where it really starts to interact is with the fact that government and laws move at such a different time scale than technology, of course, so that eventually this is all going to get resolved in the courts to some degree. This is what they're allowed to collect. This is what they're not allowed to collect. This is a violation. This isn't. And that's going to take years. And it'll go through all kinds of iterations depending on the business models that happen to be in power and who happens to have influence over that. It's a brutally difficult problem. We can do the best we can to try to keep something, but honestly, I want Google to know where I am so that when I ask for directions, it shows it immediately. In other words, in all too many cases, I'm willing to give up personal information for convenience. And it's hard not to. That's the whole idea, right?
In a web browser, and you touched on something very important, you're opting in. In a web browser, anytime it's using navigator.location, you get prompted, you are opted to say, yes, I would like you to know where I am, or no, I wouldn't. I go to some websites and they say, hey, I'd like to know where you are, and I say, no, you don't need to know where, but it's very visible and I'm able to opt in.
Yeah, but
What
it
I
seems to
did-
ask me every single time I go back to that site. Drives me crazy.
Well, that's the flip side, yeah. When this Facebook issue came out, I had never really been too concerned about Google using it. Kind of what you were saying. It's not necessarily a bug, it might be a feature. I like that Netflix makes recommendations based on my movies. But I'm a paying customer, and I am opted into that experience. I'm consenting to that kind of thing. Google, in fact, is an advertising company that just happens to offer search services. Right. And so there are companies that offer search services without the corresponding advertising. I went into all my browsers on my mobile devices and changed the default browser search engine from Google to DuckDuckGo.
Right.
And DuckDuckGo, in addition to being fun to say, is just that. It's a search engine that doesn't track you. It doesn't track that kind of information. I have not noticed a drop in the fidelity of my search results and everything, but I do feel a little bit better that I'm intentionally using a search service that doesn't come along with all those unintended experiences and features as well.
But speaking of an unintended consequence, by the way, the result of all those congressional hearings and everything is likely to be that Facebook, the point is that people were concerned in the US who didn't know any better that Facebook was giving away your data. And of course, they're not giving away your data. They're selling advertising based on your data. That's very different. And what the result of all, the problem was Facebook thought they could become a platform and make it available so that third parties could get access to data through apps. And that's where the Cambridge Analytica stuff came in and all those others.
That was years ago, though.
Yeah, but that's where the scandals came from, was a lot of that Cambridge Analytica stuff, which they no longer allow anymore in a way, So really what the result of all this will be is that Google and Facebook, who are the two primary advertising media these days for anything digital, are going to lock down all that data so that everybody has to go through them in order to get tailored, targeted advertising or anything like that. So it's not that they are giving away your information, it's that they have become the gatekeepers. And you could go ahead and use another engine, but how many people are going to do that in Google's? The two of them basically are going to own the digital advertising industry for the foreseeable future.
There are two articles that came out recently that discuss this directly. The World Wide Web just celebrated its 29th birthday last month. There was another major milestone that over half of the world right now is online. And Tim Berners-Lee, in this article celebrating the 29th birthday, should be striking a celebratory note. And in fact, he said, we have two very important myths that we need to break. Myth number one is that the only way that the web works is through an advertising model. And myth number two is there's nothing we can do to change that.
Fascinating. That's
some deep stuff. There's another article I'd encourage you to go on DuckDuckGo and search for. It's called The Internet Apologizes. And it's a very long form article, but it is the founders of the internet. It is the people who wrote Facebook and GitHub and Reddit. And it's really encouraging to hear them say, we didn't do this out of malice, much like the Volkswagen developers. We did this out of innate sense of optimism. We thought that we were making the world a better place, and we didn't consider that the tools we were putting out could be used for ill as well as good. The founder of Reddit said, I have a hard time sleeping at night thinking about what I've created. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, says, I don't let my nephews and nieces have unfettered access to games and social media. And so it's really an interesting article. The internet apologizes, hearing what the founders of these technologies have to say. It's well worth your time.
And I don't know about anybody else. I use Bing. Because I figure if you can't trust Microsoft, who can you trust?
Now, I could resonate so much with your question. It's almost like it's scary. So a couple of weeks back, I was working on, I was looking through machine learning, and I came across this interesting thing of music generation through machine learning. So it's amazing, but it's so scary. It's wonderful that I can generate music through code. It's wonderful that I can put mathematics and code together to create something as wonderful as music. But it's also so scary. Following from what you said, I don't want to tell my kids that, when I was young, we used to have musicians. We used to have people playing these things called guitars. I don't want to do that. But it's also like I don't want to stop. I want to code up something. I want to create music generation. I don't want to stop, but it's so scary. So I don't really know what the conclusion here is. I don't, I know that what I'm doing today is not wrong. Probably generating a piece of music today is not wrong. But I don't know where it might take us in the future. I don't know what end it might put to something else. It falls back again a lot on the first question of what is ethical and what is not. But I don't know. It's amazing, but it's scary. That's what I feel.
Just one comment on that. I'm sorry.
No, it's a fascinating topic.
As you're saying, when you're looking for an analogy of what might happen on that, we've been through these sorts of things before. I mean, a car can drive faster than any person can run, and yet we still have races. We still have running races. And instead, what's evolved is that people drive cars. If you look at something that's more abstract than that, like say chess, for example, there are now programs that can beat the chess world champions. People didn't stop playing chess, and in fact, they started using the programs to investigate areas that they might not otherwise have been able to analyze. So I expect that when you use computers to handle the routine things, or the things that computers do well, you free up the intellectual drudgery, of that for the humans to do more of what they do well. I have no idea what image that will take with programs for music, with artists as well. I imagine, I can't imagine too many people write fugues anymore, but that's the sort of thing you can automate on a computer. But you might be able to come up with all sorts of creative things with a computer together as a hybrid.
I agree totally, because even with music generation, when I started exploring it, what we do is kind of something that would aid musicians, kind of something that would let you start out and then you do something more on top of it. So everything that you said is kind of, sounds very promising, and it sounds really good. So fingers crossed. So that's what sounds like would be great.
Hopefully,
yeah,
right.
Hopefully, right.
Yeah, but I'm with you, right.
The arts are kind of the essence of our humanity, and that's the hard thing, because when you talk about automating or becoming more productive, that's one thing, but when you start to advocate the essence of our humanity, you want to get into the arts, that's, I think, where it becomes frightening. I watched the documentary on AlphaGo, and and the Go master, I forget what the term is, whatever, Dan, like ninth Dan, whatever, really felt like he was playing for humanity.
But do you remember the result? At the end of that documentary, he's saying now they have learned approaches in Go that they might not otherwise have explored. And even though he lost, they feel that it was a productive exercise, and it may lead to advances in the game that they might not have made for a much longer period of time. So it can work out, I hope.
Yeah, I hope.
But then, you're basically getting into the specific versus general AI question, and that would open up a whole other can of worms there.
All right, who's got the next question? Welcome. Let's see, gentleman over here, and then we'll take yours. Thank you.
My question is very simple.
What's your name first? Introduce
Sorry,
yourself.
my name is Sudhakar. I'm a developer, and I'm happy to say that was started working on legacy languages and then moving to the open source. My question is, after hearing the automation or machine learning or whatever the name says, how much time do I have a job?
The same question, yeah.
I think the jobs we shouldn't be doing, we shouldn't be doing. I think a lot of us are spending time on. One example I would say is in the area of testing, as an example. If you really think about it, software verification to me is trying to find out if what we wrote yesterday still works. I think no human should ever be asked to do it. It's an insult on humanity to really ask that question. In a way, if you really think about it, manually verifying software is a violation of the DRY principle, and we shouldn't be doing this. So there's a lot of stuff that can actually be automated, and they should be automated. And to a great extent, if you really think about it, we are worried about our jobs, but throughout human history, consistently jobs have been eliminated over and over and over. And yet we have been resilient. There was time when we had to have people driving carriages around. So much manual labor had to be done before industrialization. Those jobs are gone, but new jobs were created. And what's really fascinating is, if you really look at the past 5 to 10 years, the jobs people do did not even exist. We didn't even know that such jobs exist. And what really excites me is the resilience of the human civilization. We will find things that we can actually do that are more productive, more interesting, more challenging, more innovative than the mundane things that can be left to machines to do.
I think Neil Ford
I came
quoted.
back just to say one thing. Since you said it's insult to humanity, maybe I just want to specify about the UI developer. The reason why I'm saying is, I can hear news that if I want to design a screen, I can automate 80% of code behind to that can be generated automatically, which is happening now.
And that should be. I think that's the right thing to do. We don't need as many UI developers. We have you, that's enough. Somebody had a point here.
Well, Neil Ford said once, and I love to quote him on this, he said that whenever humans do the things computers should be doing instead, the computers get together at night and laugh at us. And you mentioned in the UI that 80% of that can kind of be generated and scaffolded now. I spent a good chunk of my career as a database developer, as a DBA. And there was a time, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I used to spend a lot of time writing SQL and managing DALs, and all of that is gone. Instead, we work on other things. It's not like I didn't get knocked out of a job because nobody needs me to write SQL anymore. I just started doing something more valuable. I started working at a slightly higher level of abstraction. Like you said, solving different problems.
Right. I think that's one of the things that, in the US, we have a recession every few years, a 7-year cycle maybe, something like that. And I often listen to NPR and people talking about losing jobs. And there's usually 2 sets of people that appear on these radio shows. Those who lost their jobs, very bitter about it, extremely angry, blaming the government. To a certain degree, I would say rightfully so, right? But then there's the second people that intrigue me the most, because they will show up and say, I was a coal miner, and I'm never going to go back to mining because there's no more job here. It was extremely hard, but I went to school, I got trained as a nurse, and now I'm a nurse, and I'm making even more money, and I'm supporting my family. And those people just thrill me, because that's sheer resilience right there. They're not sitting there and saying, this is what I did before, and I'm going to sit down and continue to complain that I cannot do it again. And at some point, that's a decision each one of us have to make. Do we want to continue to do what we do? What Darwin said. Darwin did not say the fittest survives. Darwin said it's the most adaptable that survives. So if you're not willing to adapt, then we have to perish. That's the answer, unfortunately. And it's going to be a very hard perish.
The thing is, though, it's much easier to adapt now than it ever used to be. And,
Absolutely.
the rise of mobile devices has been an enormous factor in all that. They say that the less money you have, the more valuable a mobile device is. And the growth of these devices has been worldwide. What is the estimate, I think, is that there's over 3 billion Android devices in active use right now and about 1.7 billion iOS devices as well. We're no longer addressing people who had a laptop and are moving to a handheld. We're addressing people who never had any electronic device at all. But the beauty is, as you were pointing out, that now you can get people who have opportunities that they might never otherwise have had. We have access to information that had been extremely difficult to get and ways of learning and training so that, I mean, how could that not fail to come up with major advances in unexpected areas from unexpected contributors in the near future? I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
I like this quote by someone who said that industrial automation has made a plateau, a common plateau between the celebrities and the common man. They use the same phone, iPhone or an Android phone. There's no difference between a celebrity and you because you're a celebrity too. Because if you can own an iPhone and so does a celebrity, there's nothing exceptional that they have that you don't have.
That's interesting. Please.
Culture that we have within corporations, one being competition, the other being collaboration, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think both are equally required. They're like the yin-yang, I would say, right? And without one, you cannot really, push the human boundaries or limits, rather. So if you're looking at a company, it's just a group of people coming together to solve some common problems, right? And it could be your own problems or somebody else's problems, but ultimately you're coming together to solve it. And in that process, you have to collaborate as well as compete. And each one has to be done as two independently distinct tasks, right? You can't be collaborating and competing at the same time. That will be a disaster. But you have to choose which points to compete on and which points to collaborate on, right? The competition helps in kind of understanding what are the best ideas, and you kind of compete between those two ideas to see which one survives. Again, going back to Darwin's thing about adaptability, right? The best ideas need to adapt and survive, and that's why you need competition. In fact, the whole natural science of the evolution is about competition. The best gene pool, the best genes should be surviving, and they have to compete against the better ones in order to stay for the next generation. So competition is equally required. And collaboration is kind of obvious, right? I mean, without a one-man army cannot survive for too long. Some people can, like Venkat. But in general, for achieving a much larger visions of people, let's say you're building a car, right? Like Henry Ford had the vision of building a car for a common man. That requires a group of people to come together to really bring the idea together, right? An iPhone wasn't built by one man. Although it was one man's vision, it wasn't one man's execution, right? So you need a collaboration over there to kind of build these large-scale visions. And in that process, you can have a lot of competition between also to see which is the best way to implement this particular solution. And in fact, when the iPhone OS was being created, they had a choice between a Linux kernel and a Mach kernel. And they had a bake-off between them. So, and obviously, I think the Mach kernel won, I guess. And that's what survived. And this is I think, a yin-yang kind of a thing, right? So it's a cycle. One and helps the other to kind of do its job, and so it kind of feeds into each other to kind of create this human evolution into the future.
Please. He's competing with himself.
I am, actually. No, I think there are healthy and unhealthy ways to create competition.
Yep.
And I think we owe it to ourselves to push back against unhealthy competition in organizations. Like a lot of corporate culture, and I know this is very big in the United States, there's a big push, and people are always kind of clamoring to get credit for ideas and things like that. And I found the most effective way to turn unhealthy competition into healthy competition, one of the things to do is to give people credit. Instead of forcing them to fight for it, give people credit. Where competition can become toxic is where it incentivizes us to cut corners and to make bad decisions. So, there's a balance that you need. You need that balance. You need that yin and yang to kind of go on that metaphor there.
Very good.
Hi everyone, my name is Aditya Tangirala. So I have a question when we see that 1 in 10 people or 1 in 5 people are the Indians who are the key decision makers directly or indirectly. But we do often hear that last week when we say Infosys Giant says that 80% of youngsters of Indians are not fit for a job oriented, or last month, like February, we hear that Steve Wozniak saying that Indians are not creative. I just want to know what is your perspective on that?
in a lot of
Just-
cases,
Just wanted to add one more thing, not to be a debatable one, just wanted to your view.
well, one of the interesting things that ties into that with the companies and everything is the idea of a culture. Is that generally what happens with a company is that the founders do some things right, and then the company becomes successful, and then based on those things, they just assume that's why they were successful. That becomes part of the culture. So that people just automatically adhere to that and follow along on that because that's why we were successful. And unfortunately, of course, the world changes, the company changes, everything has to change with it. When you describe certain groups of people or countries or whatever as having particular characteristics, well, in a way you were saying that they actually became successful doing that. But now we may have reached the limit of success in that area and want to go on beyond. Well, people are very complex individuals. Anybody can do anything. The question is, where does that creativity go? What becomes the next step? It may be that the structures that emerged associated with the success that happened doesn't necessarily foster that creativity or make it easier, but I'm sure it's there. It just simply needs to find a way to express itself in order to move to the next level.
I would say maybe two, if not three things. One is, to a certain degree, I would argue that kind of opinion is dated. And the reason I say it is, I left India 30 years ago, and I really had no contact at all for, I'm going to say, maybe about 15 years. So I was pretty disconnected. I had no clue what was happening here. And then the first time I came back here, maybe 15 years ago, I have to say I was extremely disappointed because I could see a very big difference between developers in India versus developers elsewhere. But I can tell you, I've been here several times a year for the past 15 years. And the tipping point was maybe about 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, I was like, oh my gosh, this is different now. And I saw developers becoming much more courageous, much more interactive, much more bold. And suddenly, they did not carry the constraints of their parents. And it got me thinking, I say this quite often, something we don't realize, and this is something we need to keep in mind very clearly is, every 10 years is a new generation. You know, almost everybody on the stage have children who are maybe 15 to 20 years old. And can you imagine, in 10 years, those very children are going to be 25 to 30 years old, and they're going to be earning wages. And that's like, wow, that's another set of workforce coming in. But keep in mind, when one set of workforce walks in, there is another set of workforce that leaves. This is a built-in garbage collection that nature has introduced. This is amazing. So if you ask me, I think the future is absolutely bright. I see children today who are so bold and who are so inquisitive, who are so eager. And my recommendation is, if you want them to have a better future, step out of their way. That's all I would say to the elders. Last question. Oh, let's give the chance to this lady here. Finally somebody. There we go. Awesome.
That poor guy, though, he's on the stairs.
Hi all, my name is Malini Ramanathan and I'm from GE Digital. So that's exactly my question is, even in this room there are very few women developers, and how does the industry see the women developers and why there are very few? And even in the panel I just see only one woman sitting there. So what is your take? Thanks for that, Scott, but would like to hear from the panel what are your thoughts.
You should be lucky, you got priority before me.
Yeah, that's right, but I was just watching, there was not a single woman who stood up and asked this question. I really got this question
Thank you.
by the end, so I would want to know from all of you.
So there are a couple of things I would say. Absolutely, several people have several important things to say, but one of the privileges I have is I actually travel around the world. And I do have to say, if you look around the room, this is the maximum number of women I've ever seen in any country.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of that, actually. And I'll tell you that because I go to Europe you have to really struggle to see a woman in the room. I do training in corporate world. When I do training in India, I have about 40 to 50, even sometimes 60% women in my classes. I've done training for several years in UK. I'll tell you how many women I've had in all these courses collectively put together, 0. And so, first of all, women in engineering and computer science is a Western problem, not a problem in India, I think. I went to Kerala to speak. There were more women than men in the room. But having said that, we have a lot to do to not put down people. And it's not just women. We got various other problems as well, as we know. And it is where we need to be accommodative to give a chance for other people to raise up as well. And when we speak, when we communicate, it's very easy to lose the sense of that we're not being sensitive, because it's very common for us to speak that way. But how does the other person feel about it, right? I think being a little bit more sensitive and accommodative, I think we can go a long way. And like Scott said this morning in his presentation, some of the leaders in the Western world in the area of programming were actually women. There were not that many men because they had to go to war. And the women were the ones who were doing computing at the time. And all of a sudden, there was a time when computer science no longer was in the federal arts department. It became into engineering and math. And that was a tipping point. Something happened there that women said, we're no longer interested in this. And the civilization, culture, society, a lot of those have been really, so to say, terse as well. So I'm not suggesting by any means that there is not a problem in India, but India is much ahead in this curve than the rest of the Western world, or rest of the world, rather.
To answer your question, yeah, so it's confusing, I can say, but I think the good part is that people have started to recognize this. So first thing I want to claim, just like you said, it's not a problem just in India. So anywhere I see on the web, there's always a thought that women are underrepresented in tech. But the good thing is that it's been recognized so well that people are actually working towards it, that this notion shouldn't be there. There are companies who say we want as many women as there are men. So just like you said, there shouldn't be competition, but there shouldn't be competition between men and women in a job, in a workplace, or in technology as such. But it's also important that they're not underrepresented just for some random reason, So I truly believe that computer science or any field as such is not gender oriented. It does not matter whether you're a man or a woman or who. It's purely your talent and aptitude. And it's good that companies, every Women's Day I see that, women-specific hackathons. So there are men who come in and say, but there are no men-specific hackathons. Why are you doing this for women? But I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's bad, actually, because there has to be some sort of awareness that, look, just because you're a woman, you're no less. We want you as much as you want anybody else. And making that statement, making that point is really good. So we're definitely heading towards a lot more positive of a society, a lot more welcoming society. And I think as every day progresses, we're actually walking towards a world where there is lesser discrimination and women are as welcomed in tech as anywhere else. So that's really good.
I think with that,
Venkat, I'm sorry, can I make one final comment on that? I apologize.
Go for it.
But not enough to not make the comment. Should I just continue to stretch this out? I'm trying to make you as comfortable as I can at this point.
We got 10 seconds.
Yes, very good. There's an organization called the Grace Hopper Institute. I mentioned Grace Hopper today during my keynote. She invented the compiler. She is the reason we're here writing machine-independent source code. Look for companies that are awarded the Grace Hopper Award that specifically foster women in our industry. Look for organizations like Girl Code It, Women Who Code, Black Girls Code. There are organizations out there that are actively working for that. We need to seek out these organizations. We need to support them.
Well, I want to give hands to you because this panel would not have been possible without you bringing those wonderful questions and being such a wonderful audience. So hats off to you. And then thank you to the panelists as well. Thank you.